Hello.
And welcome to Larry's Library.
Hello, welcome to Larry's Library. We're continuing to read Swiss Family Robinson. They're all settled in the tree now, in their nice 40-foot high tree house. Well, the house isn't that high, it's just that high up. Anyway, yeah, they're in this big tree house. Chapter 15, Hopes of a Sledge. Some short lessons in useful things. All right, guys, take notes. You might learn something. I had observed along the shore many pieces of wood, of which I thought I could make a kind of conveyance for our cask of butter and other provisions from Tent House to Falcon's Stream, and had secretly determined to go early the next morning, before my family should be awake, to the spot. I had fixed upon Ernest for my assistant, thinking that his indolent temper required to be stimulated to exertion. I made him feel as a great favor the preference I gave him, and he promised to be ready at a very early hour. At the first dawn of morning, I quietly awoke Ernest. Everybody say hi, Uncle Kevin.
Hi.
He got up, and we descended the ladder without being perceived by the rest, who continued to sleep soundly. We roused the ass, and I made him draw some large branches of a tree which I wanted for my undertaking. We were not long in finding the pieces of wood, and set to work to cut them the proper length, and we then laid them crossways on the branches, which we thus converted into a kind of vehicle. We added to the load a little chest, which we found half buried in the sands, quite close to the waves, and then we set out on our return to Falcon's Stream. When we reached our abode, the chest we had brought was soon opened by a strong hatchet, for all were eager to see what was within. It contained only some sailors' dresses and some linen, and both were wet with the sea. We then sat down tranquilly to breakfast, and I next inspected the booty of the young sportsman, who had shot in all no less than 50 ortolans and thrushes, and had used so large a quantity of powder and shot that when they were about to resume their sport, my wife and I stopped them, recommending a more frugal use of those valuable materials. I taught them how to make some snares to be suspended from the branches of the fig tree, and advised them to use the thread of the karata, which is as strong as horsehair, for the purpose. Jack, who had got up into the tree and had suspended some of the snares to the branches, came down again to bring us the acceptable intelligence that our pigeons had made a sort of nest there of some dry grass, and that it already contained several eggs. I therefore forbade the boys from firing any more in the tree, for fear of alarming or wounding these gentle creatures. I also directed that the snares should be frequently examined to see that the pigeons were not caught in them, as they might be strangled in their efforts to get loose. Meanwhile, the boys and I had been busily employed. Our work was completed. 2 bent pieces of wood, the segments of a circle, which I fixed in their places by a straight piece of wood placed across, and firmly fixed to the bent pieces in the middle and at the rear, formed the outline of my machine. I then fastened 2 ropes in front, and here was a sledge as perfect as could be desired. As I had not raised my eyes from my work, I did not know what my wife and the 2 youngest boys had been about. On looking up, I perceived that they had been stripping off the feathers from a quantity of birds which the boys had killed, and that they afterwards spitted them on an officer's sword, which Fritz had fancied and brought from the ship, and which my wife had turned into this useful kitchen utensil. I approved of the idea, but I blamed her profusion in dressing more birds at once than we could eat. She reminded me that I had myself advised her to half-roast the birds before putting them into the butter, to be preserved for future use. She was in hopes, she said, that as I had now a sledge, I should not fail of going to Tent House after dinner to fetch the cask of butter, and in the meanwhile she was endeavoring to be ready with the birds. I had no objection to this, and determined on going to Tent House the same day, requesting my wife to hasten the dinner for that purpose. She replied that this was already her intention, as she also had a little project in her head which I should be informed of at my return. I, for my part, had one too, which was to refresh myself after the heat and fatigue of my laborious occupations by a plunge into the sea. I wished that Ernest, who was to accompany me, should bathe also, while Fritz was to remain at home for the protection of the family. Chapter 16. Bathing, Fishing, and a Kangaroo. We had harnessed the ass and the cow to our sledge, and resting our guns upon our shoulders, began our journey. We bade adieu to our companions and put our animals in motion. We took the road by the seashore, where the sands afforded better traveling for our vehicle than the thick wild grass. We reached Family Bridge on Jackal's River and arrived at Tent House without either obstacle or adventure, and unharnessed the animals to let them graze, while we set to work to load the sledge with the cask of butter, the cask of cheese, a small barrel of gunpowder, different instruments, small ball, and some shot. These exertions had so occupied our thoughts that it was late when we first observed that our animals, attracted by the excellent quality of the grass on the other side of the river, had repassed the bridge and wandered so far as to be out of sight. Bless you.
Thank you.
I was in hopes they would be easily found and directed Ernest to go with Flora and bring them back. Bless you, intending in the meantime to look for a convenient place on the other side of Tent House to bathe in. In a short time I found myself at the extremity of Providence Bay, which ended, as I now perceived, in a marsh producing some fine bulrushes, and further on was a chain of steep rocks advancing somewhat into the sea and forming a kind of creek, as if expressly contrived for bathing. I desired Ernest to fill a small bag with some of the salt he had formerly observed there, and then to empty it into the large one for the ass to carry, and to take care to fill equally on each side. During this time I will take the refreshment of bathing, and then it will be your turn to bathe and mine to take care of the animals. I returned to the rocks and was not disappointed in my expectation of an enjoyment the most delicious. When I had dressed myself, I returned to Ernest to see if his work had advanced. Presently I heard his voice calling out, "Father, father, a fish of monstrous size! Run quickly, father, I can hardly hold him, he is eating up the string of my line." I ran to the place from which the voice proceeded, and found Ernest lying along the ground on his face upon the extremity of a point of land, and pulling in his line, to which a large fish was hanging and struggling to get loose. I ran hastily and snatched the rod out of his hand, for I feared the weight and activity of the fish might pull him into the water. I gave the line length to calm the fish, and then contrived to draw him gently along into a shallow from which he could no longer escape, and thus he was effectually secured. We examined him thoroughly, and he appeared to weigh not less than 15 pounds, so that our capture was magnificent, and would afford the greatest pleasure to our good steward of provisions at Falcon's Stream. While Ernest went to the rocks and bathed, I had time to fill some more bags with salt. We then harnessed and loaded our animals, and resumed the road to Falcon's Stream. When we had proceeded about halfway, Flora, who was before us, suddenly sprang off, and by her barking gave notice that she scented some game. We soon after saw her pursuing an animal which, bless you, seemed endeavoring to escape, bless you, and made the most extraordinary jumps imaginable. The dog continued to follow the creature, and trying to avoid him, passed within gunshot of the place where I stood. I fired, but its flight was so rapid that I did not hit. Ernest, who was at a small distance behind, hearing the report of my gun, prepared his own, and fired it off at the instant the singular animal was passing near him, seeking to hide itself among the tall herbage just by. He had fired so skillfully that the animal fell dead at the same instant. I ran with extreme curiosity to ascertain what kind of quadruped it might be. It was as large as a sheep, with a tail resembling that of a tiger, but its snout and hair were like those of a mouse, and its teeth were like a hare's, but much larger. The forelegs resembled those of the squirrel and were extremely short, but to make up for this, its hind legs were as long as a pair of stilts, and of a form strikingly singular. We examined the creature a long time in silence. I could not be sure that I had ever seen an engraving or description of it in any natural history or book of travels. Ernest, at length, clapping his hands together, joyously exclaimed, "And have I really killed this wonderful animal? What do you think its name, father? I would give all the world to know." "And so would I, my boy, but I am as ignorant as you. One thing, however, is certain, that this is your lucky day. Let us again examine this interesting stranger, that we may be certain to what family of quadrupeds it belongs. This will perhaps throw a light upon its name." "I think it can hardly be named a quadruped, for the little forelegs look much more like hands, as is the case with monkeys." "They are notwithstanding legs, I can assure you. Let us look for its name among the animals who give suck. On this point we cannot be mistaken. Now let us examine its teeth." "Here are the 4 incissory teeth, like the squirrel." "Thus we see that it belongs to the order of nibblers. Now let us look for some names of animals of this kind." "Well, besides squirrels, I recollect only mice, marmots, hares, beavers, porcupines, and jumpers. Jumpers! That short word furnishes the necessary clue. The animal is completely formed like the jerboa or jumping hare, except that it is twice the size of those of which I have read a description. Wait a moment. An idea strikes me. I will wager that our animal is one of the large jumpers called kangaroos. To the best of my knowledge, this animal has never been seen but on the coast of New Holland, where it was first observed by the celebrated navigator, Captain Cook. You may then be highly flattered with your adventure of killing an animal at once so rare and so remarkable. But now let us see how we shall manage to drag him to the sledge. Ernest requested that I would rather assist him to carry it, as he was afraid of spoiling its beautiful mouse-colored skin by dragging it on the ground. I therefore tied the forelegs of the kangaroo together, and by means of 2 canes we, with considerable trouble, contrived to carry it to the sledge upon which it was securely fastened. We at length arrived happily, though somewhat late, at Falcon's Stream, having heard from a great distance the salutations of our family. We concluded the day with our ordinary occupations. I gave some salt to each of our animals, to whom it was an acceptable treat. We then skinned our kangaroo and put it carefully aside till the next day, when we intended to cut it to pieces and lay such parts in salt as we could not immediately consume. We made an excellent supper on our little fish, to which we added some vegetables, nor were our faithful companions Turk and Flora neglected. The labors of the day had more than usually disposed us all to seek repose. We therefore said our prayers at an early hour, mounted our ladder, and were soon asleep. And that's the end of chapter 16.
Bye.
No, we're not leaving yet. We got chapter 17. We're only 11 minutes in. Almost 12. Chapter 17. This is a short chapter too. Chapter 17. More stories from the wreck. I rose with the first crowing of the cock, descended the ladder, and set about skinning the kangaroo, taking care not to deface its beautiful smooth coat. But I advanced so slowly in the business that my family were assembled about me and calling out famine before I had finished my work. Breakfast over, I ordered Fritz to get ready for tent house, where we should prepare the boat, and again proceed to the vessel. We took Ernest and Jacques a little way with us, and then I sent them back with a message to their mother, which I had not the resolution to deliver myself, that we might be forced to pass the night on board the vessel and not return till the evening of the following day. It was most essential to get out of it, if yet afloat, all that could be saved, as a moment might complete its destruction. We got into the boat, and gaining the current, quickly cleared Safety Bay and reached the vessel, whose open side offered us ample space to get on board. When we had fastened our boat, our first care was to select fit materials to construct a raft. Our boat of staves had neither room nor solidity enough to carry a considerable burden. We therefore looked about and found a sufficient number of water casks, which appeared to me proper for my new enterprise. We emptied them, replaced the bungs carefully, and threw the casks overboard, after securing them with ropes and cramps so as to keep them together at the vessel's side. This completed, we placed a sufficient number of planks upon them to form a firm and commodious platform or deck, to which we added a gunwale of a foot in depth all around to secure the lading. Thus we contrived a handsome raft, in which we could stow thrice as much as in our boat. This laborious task had taken up the whole day. We scarcely allowed ourselves a minute to eat some cold meat we had provided, that we might not lose any time in looking for the provisions on board the vessel. In the evening, Fritz and I were so weary that it would have been impossible for us to row back to land, so having taken all due precaution in case of a storm, we lay down in the captain's cabin on a good elastic mattress, which induced such sound repose that our prudent design to watch in turn, for fear of accident, was forgotten, and we both slept heavily, side by side, till broad daylight opened our eyes. We rose and actively set to work to load our raft. We began with stripping the cabin of its doors and windows with their appendages. Next we secured the carpenter's and gunner's chests, containing all their tools and implements. Those we could remove with levers and rollers were put entire upon the raft, and we took out of the others what rendered them too heavy. One of the captain's chests was filled with costly articles, which no doubt he meant to dispose of to the opulent planters of Port Jackson or among the savages. In the collection were several gold and silver watches, snuff boxes of all descriptions, buckles, shirt buttons, necklaces, rings, In short, an abundance of all the trifles of European luxury. But the discovery that delighted me most was a chest containing some dozens of young plants of every species of European fruits which had been carefully packed in moss for transportation. I perceived pear, plum, almond, peach, apple, apricot, chestnut trees, and vine shoots. We discovered a number of bars of iron and large pigs of lead, grinding stones, cart wheels ready for mounting,
Pigs
a complete
of
set.
Pigs of lead? I don't know.
It's just a size. It's a piece of lead, like a bar of lead. A complete set of farrier's instruments, tongs, shovels, plowshares, rolls of iron and copper wire, sacks full of maize, peas, oats, vetches, and even a little hand mill. The vessel had been freighted with everything likely to be useful in an infant colony so distant. We found a sawmill in a separated state, but each piece numbered and so accurately fitted that nothing was easier than to put it together for use. We, with difficulty and hard labor, finished our loading, having added a large fishing net, quite new, and the vessel's great compass. With the net, Fritz found 2 harpoons and a rope windlass, such as they use in the whale fishery. He asked me to let him place the harpoons, tied to the end of the rope, over the bow of our tub-boat, and thus be in readiness in case of seeing any large fish, and I indulged him in his fancy. Having completely executed our undertaking, we stepped into the tub-boat and pushed out for the current, drawing our raft triumphantly after us with a stout rope, which we had been careful to fasten securely at its head. And that is the end of chapter 17. So tomorrow will be chapter 18, The Tortoise Harnessed.
We love 3 chapters.
3 chapters. They were short chapters, though, weren't they?
They were like 2 pages each.
Yeah.
But all together, we were
It was like, this has been Larry's Library. Thank you.
like 40 pages.
Bye.